They buried the wrong body and left my son alive as if he were nobody. Ricardo Tavares's lament echoed down the hospital corridor, slicing through the heavy atmosphere like a sharp blade that demanded attention. 6 months. 6 months of mourning, of tears flowing endlessly, of a pain that hammered incessantly in his chest. He had stripped himself of Miguel in the most cruel farewell, that of losing a child. And now the truth loomed grotesquely before him. Before him lay the disfigured body of a boy, scars that narrated a story he had hoped never to hear. For a long time, the image of his son in his mind had been crystal clear. Now it was replaced by a distorted version. Tired eyes, faltering voice, yet one firm word: Miguel. In that moment, death did not seem so certain. It was an illusion now fading, transforming into an accusation weighted by evidence. Miguel was one of the survivors of a bus accident that shook the city. Lives lost beneath a shroud of confusion. Children, teenagers, teachers, all intertwined in the horrendous headlines on pages that felt distant from the real pain. Miguel was quickly identified, buried without ceremony, without a proper goodbye. Ricardo visited the grave, touching the earth, but with each visit, the weight of doubt began to seep into his mind like a virus. And now, he was here, in the chilling emptiness of a hospital that had been his home for months. Ricardo buried the pain beneath an avalanche of questions. How could his son be declared dead? Who was buried in his place? And the image of the child in his arms beside the coffin emerged in his mind, a boy without family, without identity, who when looking at him should have been asking questions, not answering them. Memories of Miguel came in fragments, pain, confusion. But one image stood out, an unknown boy huddled in a corner. Miguel, who is he? Miguel tried to unearth his own memory, but it came in flakes like ashes, dissipating upon touching the air. Understanding meant sinking into a sea of uncertainties. Ricardo was not just seeking answers. He wanted justice. Soon the investigation began, not rushed, but also without rest. The cold walls of the coroner's office echoed the horrifying mistake, misidentification, the exchanged body. Each report, every document seemed to scream, but what he found, beyond the technical error, was negligence, a deep-rooted routine of disregard and haste. Then, a name emerged from the shadows: João. A street boy cloaked in a shroud of invisibility, no documents, no family, no name, buried as if he had no past, as if he had never entered the world. What troubled him most was that João should not have been on the bus. Witnesses spoke, murmured about the boy who sneaked in, with assistance from someone powerful, an adult who knew but chose to silence it. The mistake was not merely a slip. Something much darker loomed over this story. The courtroom, when the day finally arrived, transformed into a theater of outrage. Ricardo was not just presenting evidence. He became the voice of Miguel and João. The evidence was crucial, yet the omissions, the failures, the moments when humanity had been forgotten, amplified the sound of his cry. What happened to the real Miguel? He questioned, with the urgency of someone who knows that tears of pain do not pay for a life. Each mistake, every inconsistent report, each testimony was there, etched into the walls of justice like a final act. The final revelation was a bomb ready to explode. The teacher who organized the trip knew. He saw João on the bus and chose to remain silent. He allowed the tragedy. Ricardo could not begin to measure the impact of this. He looked at Miguel's scars, and the connection between the two boys became an open wound that the system desperately tried to heal. If this has upset you, subscribe to the No Mercy badge and hit the like button now. As Miguel stepped forward, he stood tall before everyone, their gazes fixed on scars that told not just a tale of pain, but of survival and resilience. The truth settled in like an undeniable echo. There was nothing that could justify the actions taken. The indignation was palpable, much like the cold, metallic scent of justice lingering in the air, a grotesque error, an unacknowledged life, a mourning that for months remained silent. The world moved on, and João's life was erased. Yet, under the spotlight of truth, the flame of hope flickered to life. In the courtroom stillness, the tension was thick. The space, usually so impersonal, now resembled a battlefield between truth and anguish. The walls, witnesses to scorn, held secrets tight. All eyes turned to Ricardo, bracing himself to reveal the struggle he had endured over the past months. The fight for justice. He rose, feet anchored to the ground, as if the gravity of the situation sought to pull him down. Miguel, beside him, was caught in a state of tense anticipation, his body still bearing the marks of unimaginable suffering, trembled slightly. It wasn't just the physical pain that haunted him, but the emotional burden of knowing his life had been reduced to a grotesque identification error. He raised his hand, not to shield himself from what was to come, but to seek support. Ricardo's fingers intertwined with Miguel's, and in that simple yet powerful act, there was a shared resilience. "This isn't merely about a mistaken identity," Ricardo began, his voice choked yet resolute. "This case lays bare the failures of a system that should protect life, but instead disregarded it. It wasn't just the lost documents, it was humanity itself." The words resonated, echoing in the minds of everyone present. It wasn't just one life, but João's life that was at stake. The boy who had been forgotten, erased, as if his existence had never mattered. Data appeared in a masterfully crafted presentation, yet the statistics felt anything but cold. There were faces behind the numbers. Each life quantified had someone behind it, a narrative rich with experiences, suffering, and hope. Miguel lifted his head. This was his new role, not merely a disfigured child, but a bearer of a message. He gazed at the judge, his image blurred by light, but in the boy's eyes there was an intensity that demanded attention. João wasn't just there by chance, Ricardo continued, gaining momentum. He didn't deserve to be discarded. Why, in the rush to bury lives, did they not also bury their responsibilities? He pointed towards the gallery where hospital and coroner staff sat, visibly uneasy. What was done to João was senseless, but who left him there? Who rejected decency? The judge bowed his head, as though feeling the weight of the gravity in those words. With a gesture of silent fury, he projected images of the accident. Bodies covered, a gag of pain. And when João's image appeared on the screen, a dusty child, devoid of documentation, with no one to claim him. A murmur rippled through the room. He was there, a backdrop to an error that had turned into a crime. Ricardo looked at Miguel. "You are here, son, alive. The mistakes of the doctors and the indifference of the staff cannot erase that." The determination in his tone emphasized the significance of this moment. Miguel observed the audience's reactions, some in shock, others with tears brimming. The truth is, life is only valued when it is acknowledged, and João was invisible. No one wanted to see, and in the end, not even the health professionals. This is the true tragedy. In that room, indignation rose like an uncontrollable fuel. The system's failures were no longer confined to yellowed papers, but were manifesting in the brutal reality spreading through the city. People began to murmur among themselves, a wave of growing outrage. The hospital's lawyers tried to counter, but it was too late for empty words. The silence of months was shattering. Ricardo pressed on. "We need to reclaim João's identity. We must ensure that he is more than just a name. He is a story that deserves to be told. The pain and grief of his family, even in their absence, must be acknowledged." Ricardo's words served as a rallying cry, and Miguel took a deep breath. He understood that this fight was not solely for his father, but for himself as well, to bring the truth to light, to rise from the shadows and unveil the heavy, tangible fragility of life. The atmosphere crackled with electricity, and in that space, the notion that a street boy could have his worth restored began to take shape. There was a spark, a revolution was on the verge of igniting. João was no longer just a distant memory, he was a cry for dignity. And when Miguel finally stood up and declared, "I am Miguel, and João is part of me," the entire room fell silent as if compelled, a collective acknowledgement of the pain that resonated with everyone present. Miguel's scars were visible, yet the courage and struggle he carried were even deeper. What was at stake now was not merely a legal battle, but the reintegration of lives, the exhumation of rights, and the recognition that every life matters and no one should be buried in silence. João was not just a name. He was a symbol, a face there, a body here. But in society's memories, a shadow. What had transpired in the weeks and months leading up to the tragedy? Some pieces of that disjointed puzzle began to come together as Ricardo delved into a horrific web of neglect. The hospital, eager to close cases, while the IML's bureaucracy suffocated lives with cold papers and numbers. Miguel had returned, but what remained of João's life? A broken bottle shattered in the corner of the courtroom. Eyes turned, and the murmurs in the benches intensified. The hospital's lawyer, impeccably dressed and with a disdainful expression, deflected with a sickly smile. It was an error, a human mistake, a tragic incident. Let's move on. But who could move on? Ricardo's indignation was a whirlwind, a wind sweeping away the burdens of all who were present. He was no longer speaking solely for himself. He was speaking for João, for every ignored life. Miguel grasped his father's hand. It has to be more than this. João needs to be heard. The boy's voice, though marked by trauma, rang clear, like a bell. A reminder that truth carries weight and that the memory of an erased life cannot be dismissed. Protests began outside the courthouse. Groups gathered, signs in hand, protesting the injustices that transcended barriers. When the system fails, society rises. Days dragged on as new information surfaced. Authority figures slowly began to feel threatened. The professor, a quiet accomplice in the negligence, was called to testify. I wasn't sure. I didn't see clearly. But some knew. João was there, hidden, and there were those who chose to ignore his origins. A boy without family. Who cares? They whispered. Trash bags, shards of glass. What else? Could be discarded. Miguel noticed the scorn of many, and in the midst of the deafening silence, he caught a glimpse of his own pain, and João's pain. Somewhere in Ricardo's mind, a battle was unfolding. The yearning for retribution against mismanagement intertwined with a fervent pursuit of justice. What served as a defense for the hospital was, in fact, an acknowledgement of guilt. Overwhelmed hospitals, doctors bombarded with deadlines, the essence of humane medicine sacrificed at the altar of productivity. In the midst of his emotional storm, Ricardo pondered, what if this happens again? To demonize a name instead of saving lives. It was a reality faced by many, tormented by the frailty of a failing system. Miguel's scars told stories that his words could not convey. When he spoke of the chill in the early hours, of the solitude that settled during the darkest nights, the audience brimmed with empathy. I was there, but they didn't see me. Each of Miguel's words was a sharp blade, slicing through the apathy that seemed to take root among people. He was not merely a survivor, he embodied a witness to the horror unfolding, the very personification of failure. A new testimony emerged. A social worker knew João, understood his life on the streets, his dreams, his pains, his longing to be acknowledged. An invisible boy, yet one who didn't wish to be forgotten. As her words spread throughout the courtroom, they began to resonate with everyone present. The walls, once oppressive, now seemed attentive. And then, reality set in. He was not just a boy without documents. He was a human being with a story. Ricardo stood up, a surge of determination igniting within him. We are here to ensure this never happens again. João should not be just a statistic, and Miguel should not bear this burden. The outrage was infectious. The atmosphere transformed into an arena of courage. What had once appeared as a mere mistake evolved into a struggle for dignity, for humanity. A body swapped, a name erased, yet lives cried out for recognition. João would remain silent no more. And behind Ricardo, Miguel, and all those seeking justice, the light of truth began to refresh the suffocating air that had once seemed insurmountable. The echo of voices, now united, pleaded for the world to listen. A new narrative was on the verge of being born. The courtroom resembled a blazing fire. Witnesses began to testify, and each word resonated like a blow against the silence. Enveloping the room, Ricardo felt the adrenaline surge. He was not there merely as a father. He was a shout against indifference. A doctor, anxious, sniffled as he explained Miguel's identification. A mix-up in the reports, a human error. His words felt like empty excuses. The pressure from the public defender's questions intensified, yet nothing would quench Ricardo's indignation. How many more lives must be lost due to incompetence? He could not restrain himself. The defense attorney attempted to divert attention, but the eyes of the audience turned to Ricardo. The injustice was evident. The fight was not just one man's for his son, but for many who had been silenced, overlooked. As he walked down the courthouse corridor, he caught the heavy scent of despair mingled with the odor of the old wood from the chairs. He was surrounded by disinterested faces, as if the tragedy of his son wasn't a cannibalistic alarm for society. Miguel was not a statistic. He was a boy with a story. And, as the doctor spoke, Ricardo remembered the promises he had made to his son while he was still alive. He had vowed to always stand by his side. The fault lies not only with the hospital, but also with everyone who deemed lives like João's unworthy. Ricardo didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Instead, he felt the resoluteness of his cause. Promises became his weapon. He wouldn't speak solely for Miguel, but also for João, who never got a chance to become someone. The Mo. Deeper Ricardo delved, the more raw and exposed the truth revealed itself. The defense revolved around minds that discarded lives like João's, as if they were mere dried leaves on the ground, devoid of worth. Just then, a crucial witness emerged. As she entered the courtroom, her gaze fell upon Miguel, her eyes filled with horror and compassion. "João was with me. I saw him get on the bus. He shouldn't have been there." Her voice quivered, yet the clarity of her truth cut through the air like a blade. There stood the beast that fueled the system, a teacher who overlooked João's presence, a choice made with callousness. As the truth began to seep out, the atmosphere shifted. Miguel's back straightened, his scars visible to all. A testament of survival, it was a cry of defiance. The people around felt the tension rise. Ricardo could see the transformation of indifference into empathy reflected on their faces. Whispers started to swell, voices merging into a chorus of outrage. "The system has failed us." Ricardo's words resonated through the room. He was there to unveil the truth, to demonstrate that nothing was tolerable when it stemmed from the shadows of neglect. "How many more, sirs?" His words carried weight, a bold echo. The trial was not just a fight for Miguel or João. It was a struggle for every forgotten life. As the pressure mounted, evidence began to surface. Documents revealed that the push for results was an unending pressure. Deadlines and protocols had been ignored. Then came a devastating piece of evidence. An email from a hospital staff member, brief and sharp as a bullet, stating, "We are in a hurry. We can't delay." What else was concealed? As Ricardo's journey unfolded, his gaze sought each person present, striving for a stormy understanding, a wave of outcry. The courtroom morphed into an emotional battlefield where each word became a knife and every glance was a blade pressed against flesh. Miguel's scars were not merely physical, they testified to what it meant to survive in a society where some lives are deemed disposable. The indignation was tangible. Ricardo, now a force of nature, confronted a system trying to erase the truth. As the judge prepared to conclude the hearing, Ricardo raised his hand, and silence reverberated. He knew he had to finish revealing the pain that not just Miguel, but João too felt. The truth could not be buried. In that courtroom, he became the voice of the forgotten. The fight for justice had commenced, and with that, the blazing fire of the courtroom burned ever more brightly, illuminating the faces of those who finally listened. Ricardo watched each witness take the stand. Every testimony unearthed a new layer of pain, of outrage. The first was a nurse who grew visibly anxious discussing the case. "We were pressed by urgency. The team didn't have enough information and the body that arrived was unrecognizable." Her words came out in gasps, as if the memories tormented her from within. But Ricardo knew this did not justify the life that had been extinguished. The next testimony was from a doctor who looked down, avoiding eye contact with the audience. His voice trembled, but if not for the sweat trickling down his temples, it seemed like his words would flow sequentially and impassively, as though rehearsed. "There was a communication failure. I was insensitive in my assessments." Such empty phrases, so lukewarm, while João's life was literally thrown away. Ricardo turned his gaze back to Miguel, who sat in the front row. The boy fidgeted with his hands. The scars on his face told stories that words could never convey. Miguel, the embodiment of truth, the lost son who had returned, but at what cost? Ricardo's heart tightened as he realized there was no clear answer. The boy was there, alive, yet the shadow of guilt and abandonment lingered over them. It was a grim return to reality. The lawyer's words ebbed and flowed like ocean waves. A torrent of technical jargon made everything seem more ethical, logical, yet still devoid of sensitivity. "There are no individual culprits here. The whole system is to blame," stated the IML defense attorney, as if trying to justify the fury of that grotesque error. It felt like pouring gasoline on a fire. On the table, the dust of the past seemed to come alive as every detail resurfaced. The explosion of bellies, the muffled screams, the adrenaline that coursed through the arteries of the city on that fateful day. Each of us bore our own scars, but who truly shouldered the weight of responsibility? Ricardo interrupted the monotonous flow of words. "You don't understand. João should be alive." The room froze. The heavy air became suffocating. The jurors' gazes fluctuated between indignation and helplessness. What happened to him wasn't an error. It was an act of omission, a neglect, to look at him and see only a nameless body. The truth opened wounds and overflowed with tears. The echo of his statement resonated in every corner. Miguel needed to be heard. Dressed in a simple shirt, a picture of fragility, he stood up. What would he say? The silence surrounding him felt like a cage. João was just a child. I'm not the only one suffering. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice trembling as it mingled pain with courage. Ricardo had a moment, a glimpse of everything that fight represented. Something larger than the life of a boy, a collective indignation. He was not there to amplify a sense of personal tragedy, but rather to demand justice. What the system chose to bury in the name of efficiency was, in fact, the life of a forgotten boy. João did not have a father like Ricardo. There were no swift bursts of mourning or tributes. He died without knowing that someone cared, someone who truly did. Ricardo couldn't bear the weight of this truth. Miguel placed his hand over his throat, stifling a sob. A deep gaze, stronger than physical pain, serene as a sea amid a storm. The wave of outrage intensified. The evidence was presented at a rapid pace, the mistake caused by an unfortunate combination of circumstances. However, This did not quell the hunger for justice. The hospital's error remained a permanent stain, and the realization that a child, a real human being, had been exchanged for convenience only highlighted how flawed the system was. Ricardo turned again, focusing on the judge's face, a look of compassion mixed with the harshness of reality. She was trying to balance the scales of justice, but the evidence was too heavy. When Miguel looked at her, a connection formed, a call for dignity, a demand for recognition. In an act of courage, the boy spoke again. João should not be remembered merely as a statistic. He should be a name. The room fell silent, save for the echo of his voice cutting through any distraction that could obscure the raw truth. Each piece of the puzzle began to fit together, and Ricardo understood that this struggle could last beyond a trial. It was a battle for life, for identity, a fight for the memory of those who never had the chance to be remembered. After all, society had not forgotten, and they, Ricardo and Miguel, were determined not to let history repeat itself. Ricardo felt the pressure on his forehead like an unbearable weight. The truth was nearly within reach, yet each new piece of evidence only deepened the wound. Now, the room was tainted by indignation. He scanned the faces in the audience, one by one, well-dressed lawyers and cold-eyed hospital representatives, all endeavoring to appear unshakable, but the tension hung in the air, thick like smoke from a fire on the verge of spreading. Miguel, beside him, displayed a courage that only a survivor could possess. He stood there, broken yet upright, and with each word he spoke, justice transformed from a distant dream into a tangible possibility. Witnesses came and went, and the nurse's account still echoed in Ricardo's mind. The disdain she had felt while discussing the identification procedures. Haste led us to this, she had said, almost as if to justify her actions. Miguel's scars burned in their exposure, a stark reminder that haste cost lives. Not only his sons, but also João's, who never had the chance to be acknowledged. Miguel, now with tears welling in his eyes, gazed at the nurse. The silence between them was heavy with meaning. She knew, yet she could not intervene. The guilt radiated from her like a foul odor, with no way to escape. Ricardo rose, his feet firmly planted on the ground, feeling the resolve of his decision. He turned around the room. How many more must vanish before you finally open your eyes? His voice, raw and resonant, filled the space. The echo of his question sent chills through some in attendance. He was ablaze, not just for himself or Miguel, but for João, for every child lost in the statistics. Let's stop treating lives as numbers. João deserves to be remembered. And those words floated in the air like a challenge thrown down. A new witness, a student of the professor, took the stand. He recounted how João always seemed out of place, as if he bore the weight of the world. He had no place, no one cared. The belief that the lives of those without homes are worth less. That was a reality Ricardo could not accept. The pain struck deep, pricking at his understanding of the world. He was not merely fighting for Miguel or João. It was a battle against a system that marginalized life and treated tragedy as mere statistics. Ricardo returned to his papers, medical records, reports, attempting to piece together a coherent narrative. He looked at Miguel and saw more than just a son. He saw a symbol, a cry for change, that the truth could only be a means to justice, not an end in itself. And as the pieces came together, he knew each one told a story, the fusion of pain and hope, forever intertwined. The shadow of negligence began to dissolve under the weight of truth. Then, the words of a hospital lawyer shattered the tension in the air. This is not a case of negligence, it's a human error. The coldness of that statement sounded like a slap. A human error? The agonizing notion that lives could be discarded due to a slip-up. It was simply absurd. Ricardo stood and locked eyes with the man. And if it were your child in the death chamber, would you still call it a human error? The courtroom was divided. Words flew like daggers, each aimed at the very root of injustice. The line between life and death was not a mere line. They were towering walls built by indifference. With every new piece of evidence, it was as if the courtroom walls were closing in, creating a safe space for the voices that had once been silenced. Miguel, with his weary gaze, turned to Ricardo. "I want to talk." A request that under different circumstances might have seemed trivial, yet in that room it resonated like a battle cry. His voice reverberated louder than any cliched call for justice and more powerful than the cold accounts of error. The audience held its breath. João mattered. He never got a chance, but I'm here, not just for myself. I'm here for him. The room, brimming with tension, absorbed every word. The struggle wasn't over, yet in that instant, the truth shone through starkly. Miguel wasn't the only one bearing the scars of what had transpired, but he was the most human among them. He was part of a living memory that couldn't and wouldn't be forgotten. And as the day would eventually close, Ricardo understood. The scars of his son and João's memories would forge a new kind of strength. A strength that would challenge not just institutions, but also the beliefs that upheld a flawed and inhumane system. Their fight was only beginning. Indignation filled every corner of the courtroom. Ricardo felt his heart racing in his throat. The harsh fluorescent light overhead illuminated tired faces, while the audience watched. Each person ensnared in their own pain and outrage. The judge, buried in paperwork, struggled to maintain order, but the atmosphere was too charged. Miguel, seated beside his father, still trembled with nerves, yet there was a sense of shared resolve. The boy glanced around, searching not only for answers, but also for a reflection of himself in that room. In the front row, the lawyers fidgeted, whispering strategies. Ricardo noticed one of them exchanging glances with a hospital staff member. A signal. A silent connection between those who should have cared and those eager to evade any accountability. Ricardo's mind raced, recalling the falsified reports and empty promises. He grasped Miguel's hand tightly, an anchor keeping him from sinking into the deep tide of indignation. Throughout the afternoon, witnesses unveiled painful truths. The nurse, her voice trembling, testified that the identification error was a common oversight due to pressure. Words that struck like an insult. Those lives were not mere numbers. They were stories marked by scars. Ricardo recalled João's face, the loneliness of a boy who had no one. He could not allow the nurse's words to be accepted as justification. Who truly cared about the lives involved? With each testimony, new layers to the narrative emerged. The coroner's office employee hesitantly admitting that bodies without identification received lower priority. What did that imply? That lives lacking identity were expendable? Such was the system, increasingly rotten, increasingly merciless. And who profited from this? Those who looked down from above, dismissing the ground beneath their feet, a fury that refused to die down. Then the back door swung open, and a man entered. It was the professor in charge of the trip. The color of his suit matched the indifference with which he assessed the lives he managed. When called to testify, his gaze was wild, a pale reflection of the truth he sought to bury. Ricardo noticed a tremor in the man's body as he approached the microphone. The tension in the room was about to reach a breaking point. Everything was under control, the professor stated, but his words came out like a disguised whisper. All eyes turned toward him. There was no room left for lies. Ricardo stood up, and in a cry that challenged authority asked, "How could you allow a life to be erased?" The voice echoed, reverberating in the minds of everyone present. For those who enforce rules and guidelines, guilt should weigh heavily, yet the professor remained unfazed, his mask still intact. The tension pierced like a blade in the throat. The room buzzed with throbbing hearts. The teacher hesitated. Before he found the words, Miguel stood up. Time froze. He no longer appeared as a child, but as someone burdened by a truth, a living testament to neglect. He had no right to be here, You didn't see me, didn't see anyone but yourself. Miguel's voice sliced through the silence, infused with pain and dignity. Ricardo watched his son, fury and hope intertwining, creating something that would forever alter the souls present. The once arrogant teacher now seemed diminished. The weight of his responsibility began to unravel. How could he defend himself against the cry of a boy scarred by indifference? Miguel was more than just a scar. He embodied the voice of all who had been silenced, and a truth started to emerge from the shadows. It wasn't only about Miguel, but about everyone who had been overlooked. João's scars were brought back from oblivion. A warmth spread in Ricardo's chest. A wave of hope enveloped the atmosphere. Justice wasn't merely a word. It was a struggle that became tangible. They would unveil what silence tried to conceal. A call not just to remember, but to honor lives forgotten by a flawed system. Thus the courtroom transformed into a battleground, not only for Miguel and João, but for all who had been buried without a name. The courtroom simmered. Ricardo breathed heavily. Every witness was like a blow against the foundation of a system that claimed to be just, yet bore the weight of so much pain. The teacher, a man in midlife, appeared like a ghost, visibly shaken as he realized his silence was one of the catalysts for that tragedy. He feigned the indignation of someone caught off guard, but Ricardo knew the corrosive guilt had already consumed him from within. "You knew João was there. You saw but stayed silent," he shouted. The echo of Ricardo's voice reverberated through the room as glances turned towards the pale man, hesitating to respond. There was a scent of fear in the air, a fear that didn't belong solely to him, but to everyone involved. Miguel's scars were more than physical marks. They were alarms of a life that should have ended, but continued its fight against oblivion. As evidence piled up, the tension escalated. Something deep and unsettling settled in every corner of that space. Someone had to be held accountable. With each tear shed, each interrogation, Ricardo felt justice drawing nearer, but not without first exposing the fragility of life in a system meant to protect it. The jury's gazes alternated between fear and compassion. What did they see? What did they feel? Ricardo couldn't be sure, but it seemed that, for the first time, a gaze could see beyond Miguel's scars into the despair of the boy who perished in the shadows of neglect. Then, Miguel raised his hand, like a superhero, finally daring to reveal himself to the world. His voice trembled, yet remained resolute. "I am Miguel, and João was my friend." The courtroom fell silent. The air thickened. The boy, with his altered face, was not just there to reclaim his name, but to give voice to a life that should never have been forgotten. The impact of those words resonated like thunder, sweeping through the room the acceptance of a harsh truth. The teacher could no longer bear Miguel's accusing gaze. He hunched his shoulders as if wishing to vanish, while murmurs grew in the audience. Ricardo realized he was not merely defending a son, but reclaiming the dignity of all who had been forgotten, invisible in the cracks of society. The collective indignation rose like a cry. At last, the verdict was delivered. The hospital and the Forensic Institute would face a lawsuit. This wasn't merely a mistake, but rather a cycle of neglect that dehumanizes lives. It wasn't a victory, it was a warning. Ricardo understood that the truth, even when revealed, wouldn't erase the scars left behind. Miguel and João were not just victims, they embodied the struggle for acknowledgement. The message crystallized: life is far too valuable to be reduced to a mere number, and every untold story carries a weight that cannot be lifted simply through justice. Society must learn to listen. Every individual matters, every life matters. Ricardo gazed at Miguel, now filled with renewed resolve. They didn't just confront the shadows of neglect. They chose to illuminate every dark corner. This fight doesn't end here, because ultimately it's about remembering that not everyone has a name, but that doesn't diminish their worth. Thus, Ricardo lifted his head, aware that together they could turn this pain into an unyielding quest, a call to ensure that no life is buried without its name being acknowledged. The system was wounded, yet the desire to rectify those mistakes could mark the dawn of a new era. So what will your contribution be to ensure that lives like João's and Miguel's are never cut from the narrative again? And if this story has opened your eyes to the value of every life, then subscribe now to No Mercy Badge and hit the notification bell. Give a like if this truly impacted you, share it with someone who needs to reflect on this, and let me know in the comments. Would you fight to the end for justice or accept the silence of the system? And now on your screen, 2 more videos are appearing. Click to watch now and continue this journey.